Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
It was only 4 years ago since one of the least edifying elections in history saw Joe Biden defeat Donald Trump in the US presidential race in 2020. But the 2024 campaign is even worse, as fake news has replaced AI, incumbent Trump has been replaced by insurgent Trump, and where, of course, Joe Biden has belatedly been replaced by Kamala Harris. With 2 hurricanes, 2 assassination attempts, 2 presidential debates, and the bizarre sight of Elon Musk and Hulk Hogan sharing a campaign stage, the US electorate inexplicably remains split right down the middle, with the election likely to come down to a few thousand votes in the swing states. So, joining Kerry and I tonight to take a collective intake of breath and talk all things USA are Dr. Joseph Phillips of the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. Hello, Joe.
Good evening.
And a current guest in Wales, Black Hawk Hancock, who is an associate professor of sociology at DePaul University in Chicago.
Good evening.
Thanks both. Before we start, Black Hawk, you're currently visiting Wales and studying here. Can you tell us a little bit about what your plans are and what you're doing?
Sure. I'm spending the semester in Cardiff working with a group called Grow Social Capital and its founders, Russell Todd and Andy Green. They're an enterprise that works with communities and organizations to develop social capital. And together we're engaged in a project called Knowable Communities Need Knowable Neighbors, which is inspired by the literary theorist and sociologist Raymond Williams, whereby we're looking to explore how communities, especially working class ones, develop their own internal resources through which they sustain themselves in the face of the ever-growing or ever-evaporating social safety net, social resources.
And Joe, you're also new to Wales. What's brought you here?
So I am a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University. I study public opinion, polarization, and misinformation. And this semester, even though there's quite the election in the US, I'm teaching elections in the UK.
So we know quite a lot about America from the news, from movies and social media. But every time we talk about the US on the pod, we always pick up some new surprises or new information. Black Hawk, you're Chicago-based. Can you paint a picture of what the USA is like in 2024? Is it, as it looks, 2 completely different countries trying to exist as one?
In many ways, you could say yes, that we are a blue state, red state country. We really are, in many ways, 2 different worlds, in that you have the blue democratic areas, mostly the, quote, liberal coastal elites of your Boston, New York, down to Philadelphia, Seattle, Portland, down to San Francisco, even down to Los Angeles, right? That line the coast, where these are the centers of capital, innovation. And then you have the middle of the country, which is the red zone, the Republican zone, which is predominantly rural and poor. So there's a great tension. And the irony in many ways is your generative economic engines are your liberal elite cities. And yet the middle of the country, the red states, if you will, control our electoral college. So this is how in the United States, you can win the popular vote, but not win the presidency. And so because we have this great divide now, this is why our elections are coming down to 3 or 4 counties in 2 or 3 states. So, it's been said that, in the last election with Trump, a group called the Lincoln Project, their goal was to swing 3% of Republican voters to vote for Biden. That was their margin. And they thought if they could swing 3%, that would bring enough voters over that would tip the balance. And they hit 5%. And in many ways, you could say that they were influential in doing this because they targeted the very areas that were really the contested states and the contested zones. Because my vote in Chicago really doesn't matter because I am a deep blue pocket. New York doesn't matter. It's a deep blue pocket. California doesn't matter because it's done. It's a deep blue state. It's no longer on the board. Nebraska is a deep red state. It's no longer on the board. So when election night comes and folks are watching in the UK and you're watching the states light up in terms of red or blue and who's winning which state, 46 of them are already known. It's going to come down to are 4 states. And within those 4 states, it really came down to 46,000 votes in Pennsylvania in the last election, which if you think about a country of 330 million people is rather terrifying.
It is. Yeah, it is amazing, actually. We're going to have to come back to that shortly. Joe, Black Hawks mentioned there the Electoral College. Can you tell us a little bit about that system and whether there are any similarities between the US and the UK?
So I think that there are definitely analogs to be drawn. So in the UK, there's a first past the post system where whichever candidate gets the most votes, whether it's 31%, whether it's 50%, will get the seat. With the Electoral College in the US, it's basically the same, but at the state level. So if a candidate wins a state, at least for 48 out of 50 states in the Union, we could get to the exceptions, they will get that state's electoral votes. The amount of electoral votes a state has is equivalent to the amount of seats that that state has in the House of Representatives, plus 2, representing the 2 senators in each state. And so in terms of the electoral map, you can think of it as first past the post, but a given candidate gets multiple votes at the same time. When it comes to kind of the map itself, at least up until 2024, now lots of things are different, but the discussions during the early 2020s in the UK and the US were pretty similar regarding electoral geography, that Democrats had a huge problem with efficiency. In a lot of places, they were running up really, really big majorities, but it wasn't enough places to get a majority in the House of Representatives. And it wasn't quite enough places to get a majority in the Electoral College. Now that's changed a little bit, just like it's changed in the UK. But at the moment, we are still down to about 7 states whose electoral votes will sway everything.
I read recently that Hillary Clinton, there was a suggestion that she lost on that small margin as well. And it was suggested that she didn't go there. I think it was Wisconsin.
Yes.
And if she'd gone there, she might have actually got up the electoral college votes she needed. But where are we in the US election at the moment? What are those kind of like few, like Joe mentioned 7 states, you mentioned 4. What are they? Is it Georgia, Pennsylvania, those type of places, is it?
Georgia is in play, Pennsylvania, Michigan, possibly Arizona. Michigan is on the border now because of the Palestinian issue, which could go against the Democrats now, which is Rashida Tlaib's, who's a very, very popular Democratic representative, but she represents a major. I think it's the largest concentration of Arabs outside of the Middle East is in Dearborn, Michigan. But because of the Democrat position being supportive of Israel, this could turn. So there's a great deal of concern about how Michigan is going to pivot on this. Pennsylvania, of course, being in play because of Joe Biden's history, but yet based on the industrial past and the working class shifting towards Trump, that's still in play. Arizona's gone back and forth. And then, of course, Georgia and the Stacey Abrams effect, she's pulling it towards, into the purple zone. So those are, I would say, the big 4 to watch in many ways.
Joe, we didn't ask you at the top of the show about where you're from in the States. Is that picture that Black Hawk has just painted something you recognize? And do you agree broadly about the swing states and the situation there?
Yes, so I'm from the Hudson Valley in New York, so not New York City, but the region just north. And it began as a very Republican region at the beginning of my life, but it has since become very purple. As for the states that I would identify, in addition to Black Hawks, as swing states, I would mention Wisconsin, Nevada, and North Carolina. In Wisconsin, it's very much there's very much a strong rural-urban divide that permeates the Democratic and Republican parties, and politics has been on a knife edge there for a very, very long time. You wouldn't necessarily know it by the composition of the state legislature because it's been majority Republican due to how the electoral map was drawn. But in terms of actual popular votes, Democrats and Republicans have been at parity for a long time. North Carolina is also an example of a swing state that has historically gone Republican, but in the same way that there's been a Stacey Abrams effect in Georgia, as well as large amounts of immigration from the Northeast and the West Coast to Georgia, you see that as well to North Carolina. And these voters are much more Democratic, meaning that states that used to be more reliably Republican have now gone into play. Nevada itself has also been a swing state for a long time. A huge influx of its population to Las Vegas and the Reno areas, largely from California, has moved it from what began as a red state, again, to swing state territory. In a lot of ways, one way to think about these swing states, yes, you can kind of concoct a story for each of them, but you can also think of it as these are places where very small gradual trends happen to manifest themselves in potentially huge ways just because of the makeup of the state at the given time.
That's an excellent point. And then you could also think in terms of, say, Nevada, possibly a bit of Arizona, the exodus from California and somewhat of, say, Seattle and Portland, folks moving in that direction with that exodus, which has changed the complexion of those states. So we see the escalation of rent and the cost of living on the coast, which is forcing those folks who would have been, say, Democratic voters inwards, which has then moved them over maybe to the next states, which has then reconstituted the makeup of those the next cities over, if you will.
I'm going off script now, but you mentioned those kind of like only a few states are going to have an impact, a massive impact. But I did read earlier the month about, I think, a couple of states, at least one, split their electoral college. Is there more of an appetite growing in America to perhaps challenge the system of the electoral college so that, the states do send those split? Or is it just limited to those two states? I think it was one in the Midwest and one on the East Coast.
Yeah, so there are two states that do this. One of them is Nebraska, which is in the Midwest, and one of them is Maine, which is one of the more northeastern states. Essentially, what they do is they allocate 2 electoral votes to the winner of the statewide vote, and then the winner of each congressional district gets that particular vote. And so usually there is a split in Nebraska and Maine, where in Nebraska, Republicans win statewide, but Democrats win one congressional district that contains Omaha, a major urban area. And then in Maine, Democrats tend to win statewide, but there is one congressional district where Republicans are very competitive, and they often win. As for whether other states have an appetite to do this exact thing, not really. When there's reform being discussed and states can kind of configure their electoral votes any way they want according to the US Constitution, there has been a bit of a pact among many states, most of which are Democratic leaning, that if enough electoral votes are reached, where if you combine the state's electoral votes, if enough are reached, then they will all allocate their electoral votes based on the winner of the national popular vote. And to the extent that people want to get away from the electoral college setup that we have, that appears to be where more of the effort has been coordinated.
Joe has a much more nuanced take on the nuts and bolts of how on the ground people are trying to align their votes for strategic advantage. I find the obsession with the Electoral College and the idea that we could get rid of it, which is always sort of bandied about every political season, just to be absolute fallacy. It's a fantasy, because the amount of political capital And the emotional, psychological investment in this it's just wasted energy. The amount of effort it would take to get rid of the Electoral College is a lifetime project. For people to waste their time and energy on that rather than pursuing the next election is just time wasted from pursuing the strategies needed to get your candidate elected. And I think the Democrats in particular spend an awful lot of time hemming and hawing and wasting their capital and energy pursuing discussions about what we can do to dislodge the Electoral College instead of pursuing an agenda of what they can actually do.
I think we've kind of set the scene there, and looking at where we are now, we're currently riding what Rich has called in the script a roller coaster, as we watch different pollsters bring in even more regular data sets. What are we seeing in terms of the top line and the crosstabs, Joe?
So for the most part, the top lines are showing a mild Harris lead, usually of about 2 to 3 points. When you get to the crosstabs, this is where people start to panic. This is where people start to argue, but they provide less information. So generally, things that people have found from the crosstabs are that Harris is down in terms of the percentage of the vote she is getting from young Black men, Latino men, and people are making a lot of hay over that because in a lot of swing states, even kind of small deviations can result in losses for that state. But at the same time, when you get to the crosstabs, you're dealing with fewer people. And when you have fewer people, you're estimating percentages of support with a lot more error. And so really one way to look at the polls is when high quality pollsters do polls on very, very specific groups. So when you do that, so when you have polls that are specifically about Black voters or Latino voters, you generally see that Harris has lost in both of these groups, but only a sort of very mild percentage. The real kind of talk with the polls as well with the top lines is in 2016, national polls estimated Clinton's vote pretty well, but statewide polls overestimated Clinton's vote in key swing states. In 2020, national polls generally overestimated Biden. And so when people look at a 2 to 3 point Harris lead, they're not looking at a 2 to 3 point Harris lead. They're thinking, well, if the polls were off by 4 points last time, is this not a Trump +1 lead? The answer is we really don't know. Unfortunately, there's no guarantee that what happened in 2016 and 2020 happens in 2024, even if we see that the error went the same way 2 times. The error in any given election is going to just be a little bit different each time.
Black Hawk, Joe mentioned some of the changing patterns there. What are the changes behind the scenes there? What's going on that is sort of influencing some of those decisions?
Well, a couple of things that should make the Democrats in particular very nervous is why is it that, say, working class to poor Black men have started to defect to Trump? Or why is it that Latino men have started to swing towards Trump? I could speculate on answers for you, but I mean, those are the types of things that the Democratic Party in particular hasn't really wrestled with and hasn't really addressed, I think for a number of reasons, and or they failed to understand why it is that the border along the US-Mexico border is also in support of Trump, and taking for granted that Latino vote, which bit them in the ass the last time, once again could bite them in the ass. And so what you're seeing is across these 3 groups that I just mentioned, you're seeing the same trope happening. That is the taking for granted of minority voters, folks of color, that Democrats assume will vote for them because they've been the party that folks of color have voted for in the United States. But how much outreach has gone to them? How much are the policies targeted towards them? What kinds of effects have they seen in the last 4 years under the Biden regime as opposed to the Trump regime? Have they seen anything? Now, of course, it's very difficult to measure quality of life from one president to another because really you can't do that. So it's not as if you can say things are radically different, from one to the next, but the sense that nothing was done, and if nothing's been done, then, well, what do I have to lose? And when you have a series of folks that feel they have nothing to lose and are turning towards a demagogue, you really have to ask the question, how far down have things gone? Because we know Trump is a racist. We know he's a fascist. And yet, if I'm a poor Black man and I think nobody's done anything for me, I've got nothing to lose. Why not try something else? Which is a position that a lot of working class Black men have taken. I can speak about that from the Detroit area where I grew up. In particular, the New York Times ran a 3-page spread on this. And yet I still see very little going on to address this, which is just, in my mind, completely alarming.
It is. I think you've mentioned a few issues there that would be very resonant in Wales and the UK. Questions of migration and people feeling left behind. Joe, I think I'm not unusual, as you know, in Wales and Europe and the United Kingdom, in watching this campaign and finding it quite extraordinary that this is even a close race. After all the things that Trump has said and done, going back not just 4 years, but going all the way back to 2015. How is it that the Biden-Harris administration hasn't managed to turn the page, to coin a phrase, and leave Trump firmly in the past?
So I think one huge problem that the Biden campaign and later the Harris campaign have had is that voters are incredibly desensitized to all that Trump has done. The fact that Trump is a racist, that he's a misogynist, is not new. Trump's anti-democratic rhetoric, while escalating, is also not new. And so to a certain extent, voters have already baked that in. And you don't see it too much on the news covered. You've seen a lot sort of historically before Biden dropped out about how his age has hampered him. You've seen a lot of news stories about, say, how Harris is losing among this demographic or that demographic. But the things that make Trump concerning are not typically broadcast to people. And even if you do broadcast about it, one problem is that only maybe about a fifth of Americans are really tuned in sort of day in, day out and notice all the stories that are on the New York Times or the Washington Post website. And so to kind of encapsulate an answer to your question, I think voters aren't necessarily seeing the same picture that people who are in it day in and day out are.
On that point about political engagement in the US, does that fit into any of this at all? Like, will Kamala Harris, potentially a first female president, will that generate greater interest amongst the US electorate?
It's complicated. So Harris hasn't quite mobilized based on race or gender in this campaign. And I think that was a calculated decision to try to not alienate white, non-college educated voters who are pivotal in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There have been other sort of gendered dynamics, though, with the election. And one of them is abortion. So for those unfamiliar, the Supreme Court, in a recent decision in 2022, struck down Roe v. Wade, which at the time gave constitutional protections for abortion rights as part of a general panacea of the right to privacy. Abortion laws then became a state matter, and overnight, a couple of dozen states had either outright bans or severe restrictions on elective abortion. And so in 2022, there was a huge voter registration and mobilization push, and this was especially effective among young women. And in many states, there were referenda to overturn or to not let go into effect these restrictive laws. And there's a large continuation of that in 2024. Now, Democrats have fewer states to do that in now than in 2022, sort of being a victim of their own success there. As for engagement in the overall election, though, when I say there isn't much media engagement, I don't want that to be confused with lower voter turnout. In 2020, people thought the stakes were high, and nearly 2/3 of eligible voters turned out, actually over 2/3. It might be lower than last time, but we're still talking about historic highs. People still perceive the election as having pretty high stakes. And so even if, say, it's only 63 or 64%, that's still very high for the US in terms of literal voter engagement.
That's interesting. I thought it might have been higher. That's probably below the UK general election turnout, but significantly higher than a Welsh Senedd turnout in that middle ground. I thought it's been a momentous. We've had an assassination attempt. We've had a change of candidate. Any of those big ticket items really swung support in either direction.
Joe's in a better position to give you a more precise answer here, but the extremes seem to come and go, and yet, the sort of, the water just seems to stabilize back at the kind of just a little above, a little bit below, despite these extreme events that occur, which you would think would shock the populace one way or another, but it seems this goes somewhat to characterizing the numbness of the American population or their indifference to anything that does happen. They're already convinced on who they're voting for. They've already made up their minds. And so these sorts of things don't really matter.
So if the country is like that and nothing is really moving the dial, does that mean that people are just fed up or have lost faith in the way that the political system has worked?
So I'm going to talk about two pictures of the last 4 years that people commonly have. On the Republican side, you began with a pandemic that they think that Democrats used to try to institute an Orwellian New World Order. Then, after Biden stole the election, inflation went up and the world came to chaos. Chaos that they think only Trump could have fixed. The Democratic version of the world, which I don't want to confuse as equally untrue, it's not, is that in 2020, Trump left America to die. And after Biden won, Trump tried to steal the election anyway and unleashed a giant mob to the Capitol to do so. And Biden has plodded along in a very chaotic world and has done his best despite being handed a very, very dire situation, both economically and in terms of the pandemic. And that Harris would be a continuation of that. This sort of epistemic divide, so this divide in what people think has even happened, goes hand in hand as well with two very opposite visions of what people want out of America. Do you want a multiracial democracy, or do you want continued white dominance? Do you want there to be a robust rights regime for lots and lots of people, or do you want a certain kind of person to have privilege? Do you want religious pluralism, including the ability to not subscribe to a religion, or do you want Christian dominion over the US? And the answers to those questions are very different among these two segments of people. And that's why it's so hard to move anything in the polls, because people have a very clear vision of what they want out of America, and they tend to buy into one of these two epistemic visions of what has gone on over the last 4 years. And to the extent there's any movement in the polls just beyond sort of random noise, it's the uninspireds, not the undecideds. It's people who aren't quite convinced of the side that they're on, of the side they're already on, I should say, not people who are genuinely up for grabs.
Where does that leave civic society in America, has that democratic consensus become truly broken? You know, is there erosion of social trust in your democratic institutions? Like you mentioned Roe v. Wade, Joe, and appointed officials, judges in the Supreme Court is something in the UK it's hard to understand. But I just feel like everything in American society is partisan now, from school board to the Supreme Court to the White House. You know, Black Hawk, is that a fair summation of civic society in the States?
Sure. Well, last year, the Supreme Court had a 26% faith in the institution rating. It usually reigns in about like 70 to 80%. I mean, between the military and the Supreme Court, those institutions never waver. It has fallen down to under 30% of the American public believe in the Supreme Court. That gives us a real serious gauge of how far the American public has fallen. I mean, how little faith we have in our institutions anymore, which starts to push the threshold of how far can these institutions hold, right? And it is, as people were saying while Trump was in office, well, he's got enough sane people around him that they can rein him in. The barricades will always hold. You know, we have democracy. We have these rules in place. No, he ran roughshod over all of this stuff. And as a result of this, that further frayed the social contract with people. And so I would look at this and say, you know, the social trust factor, the faith in our institutions, is just one metric you could use to start to look at this fraying of the social fabric. And I think it's much more frayed and frazzled than it may appear on the surface, which is why we have so much simmering unrest throughout the country.
Yeah, so I've been going into the statistics a lot tonight, but let me talk about this with an anecdote. Now, as an instructor, when I'm teaching in a political science class, I don't generally want students to know what I think about things, and I'm not there to tell students what they think, what they should think about things politically. I'm there to give them a certain lens of inquiring about the world. In 2020, that proved impossible. So in the summer of 2020, I taught a public opinion class, and this was in the height of COVID. All the classes moved online, and yeah, it was kind of up to a lot of instructors to reinforce that certain safety procedures should be followed around COVID. So if you go out in public, you should wear a mask. You should probably minimize the extent to which you're interacting with people outside your household in other indoor settings. And in the summer of 2020, it became impossible to advocate for that without immediately making it clear which party you were going to vote for in 2020. And this is just one of many, many patterns. Almost anything that somebody wears, that somebody buys, that somebody drives, can be a signal of partisanship. And likewise with institutions, almost anything any institution does, whether it's meant to be a partisan act or not, can be read that way. Now, with the Supreme Court, once there was a 6-3 conservative majority, it became quite obvious that the decisions changed in a much more right-wing direction. But you can think of many institutions where there hasn't been much of a partisan shift. So, for example, local election boards. These historically have been run in a pretty nonpartisan way. These are often volunteers or people who are paid way less than they should be for a major administrative task, and these people just generally want to run it well. Over the last few years, their work has become read as ways to rig the elections in favor of the Democrats. And so people doing their job have now been the subject of many, many threats, to the point now where many of those local election officials have resigned. And the types of people who were making the threats of these election officials are increasingly on those electoral boards. And the way that they see themselves is not as partisan usurpers of a nonpartisan process, but as people exercising a counterpower to what they see as a partisan process. And this is where I kind of think that the institutional decay is happening. There isn't so much this idea of let's run these institutions the best that we can for the population we have. It's how can we capture this so that either we can exercise power or the other side can't.
No, that's incredibly interesting, and it resonates a lot with my own personal political views in the UK. But after another pod, we're coming to the crunch time in the pod now, where we're really going to have to put you on the spot on your predictions. Michael, would you go first?
Well, I'm going to go against everything I've said this evening, which has been pessimistic, and hope that Kamala Harris will win this one, despite all of the struggles against her. Even as dark as my pessimism is, I have to hold out hope that she will.
And Joe, how are you on hope?
So if I were to put money on it, and I'm not going to bet that I'm going to eat some hat or eat some book about this, there are lots and lots of plausible outcomes. But if I were to bet on an outcome, it would be a 276 to 262 electoral vote win for Harris. I think out of the swing states, she will narrowly win Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. But she will not retain Georgia, Arizona, or North Carolina.
Well, Black Hawk, you want to come in on that?
Oh, I just thought Joe's assessment right there was spot on. That is exactly, I would have picked exactly the same array of states, and I think that's very insightful.
We're going. I'll just done again. 276 for Harris, 262 for Trump. We're gonna hold you to that, Joe, and we'll come back and get your thoughts afterwards. But it is afterwards now, which I'm going to come to, because the aftermath of the election 4 years ago was incredibly worrying. What happened in Washington was, I think it was unbelievable. I don't think many in the Western world would have imagined that a mob would have invaded Washington as they did. Do you think that if Trump doesn't win this time, something like that is likely to happen again, or is the potential to happen again?
I don't think that will happen again, but the possibility for chaos with him always exists. With the people around him, with the numerous affiliations he has with right-wing extremists and neo-Nazi groups, there's always an element of that, and chaos cannot be predicted. And so I would say that despite the fact that we can say, our military can say, our intelligence can say, we're prepared for the next time, this won't happen again. They were prepared for the last time and the time before. So it's the problem of chaos, not the problem of a strategically planned event that's the problem. And so no one knows what will happen, where it will happen. I mean, we could see outbreaks, uprisings in cities all over the place that are kind of unpredicted. And those small uprisings in different places, since it's not in one particular place, could cause more havoc in some senses than one centralized place of havoc.
So, sort of building on that, we've discussed quite a lot of factionalism over the pod so far, and obviously that's not going to come to an end on the 6th of November. So is it reasonable to think about whether this, what you might call a cold civil war, might just continue?
I think a lot hinges on what MAGA does post-Trump, which could be after 2029 or it could be in 2025.
Yeah.
So Trump in a lot of ways, is no longer leading the MAGA movement in terms of its stated ideology. He used to. He used to kind of call the shots as to what this movement generally supported. Starting a little after the 2020 election, the movement started to lead him. And there are a lot of different personalities, a lot of different figureheads, but it's a very fractional movement other than with Trump's support. And for a little bit, after the RNC, after the convention, it looked like J.D. Vance was going to be Trump's designated successor as leader of the movement. I'm not sure if J.D. Vance can actually command the support of this movement in the same way Trump did. And if there is no unified figure to go on, then we'll probably see this movement devolve into a series of factions. And it's hard to predict what the Republican Party will look like with these factions. But a lot about how polarized the US is will depend on what MAGA does after Trump.
Rich on the production side is just reminding me that MAGA means Make America Great Again, yeah?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say, yeah, MAGA, Make America Great Again, is one of Trump's longest term slogans. And yeah, the movement now styles itself as that.
Black Hawk, did you want to have a final say on that?
Well, I was just gonna add to what Joe had sort of parceled out for us, and what we saw happen with the rise of Trump is the death of the quote traditional, or at least the bigger umbrella of the traditional Republican in its sort of multiple flavors, and then many traditional Republicans now defecting to the Democrats, while not in complete agreement and wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as true Democrats. At least they're anti-Trump. Will that portion of the former Republican Party ever constitute itself back into something again? I doubt it. But what will happen to that big swath of voters that you would still consider to be traditional Republicans that were still out there, that lost their voice, that lost their grip on their party when MAGA took over? Because MAGA was a splinter movement which hijacked a major, one of the two political parties in our country. I mean, it's not as if they took over a small, a smaller party or a medium-sized party. They took over one of the two political parties we have. So there still exists a massive body of traditional, if you will, Republicans out there that have traditional Republican liberal values in the small, if you will, small L liberal tradition, that Democrats also value as well. Like we have liberal education, if you will, in that sense, that are still out there that have become silent or have just faded away. And so, as Joe's saying, what happens in the aftermath of this? There will be some sort of splinter of MAGA that continues to forge on, whether or not it burns out or not, or if it just continues to head down and blaze ahead in its own way. But the question is, will there be a return at some point, if they lose, with a counterbalance? Be an interesting thing to speculate, to see empirically develop or not develop in that wake, that I think we should look for in terms of reestablishing the positive nature of what a two-party system does in the United States. Because as much as we talk about the two sides of the aisle as antagonistic, there is a great deal of benefit and a great deal of stability that is built into the two-party model that has been lost.
I find America fascinating to talk about, and you've both highlighted some parts of your own societies which I wasn't aware of again tonight, and would love to do a little bit more on this in the future. But thank you both. It has been great having you and listening to your take on this really a worrying election, really, I think, depending on what comes out of it. But if people want to hear a little bit more about you and the work you do, your academic work, have you got a preferred social media approach they can find you on? Black Hawk, if anyone wants to hear a bit more about you, where can they find you?
You can find me on my webpage at DePaul University. I don't have any social media.
No problem. We'll put that in the show notes. And Joe, are you available to follow or get in touch with anywhere?
Yes, so I have a Cardiff University page, but if you want to follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky, I don't know how long I'll remain on Twitter given the way things are going. The handle is Paul Psych Joe, so POLPSYCHJOE.
We'll try and find you down and add that to the show notes as well. Okay, thanks again, both.
Yep, thanks both for joining us. It's been great to catch up, and with just a couple of days to go, I'm sure that you will be glued to the results as they come in, as we will be. Just like to tell our listeners that the information for both our guests is in the show notes. And thank you for listening. And if you would like to support the pod or find out more about the pod, you can do that at walespolitics.com. Or we're always open to financial support via our Patreon if you're so inclined and able to do so from just £3 a month at patreon.com/HiraethPod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.